I'm Duncan McLeod, and this is the TechCentral podcast brought to you today by Dell Technologies. I had a great discussion last week with Dell Technologies South Africa MD Doug Woolley, and I encourage you to go and have a listen to that if you missed it. But today I'm very pleased to be joined by Chris Buchanan, and Chris is Client Solutions Director at Dell Technologies in South Africa. Chris, it's good to see you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Duncan. Good to be here. Really excited about sharing some of the new stuff coming out of Dell.
Awesome stuff. So we're going to be talking about everything from e-waste, electronic waste, to the changing shape of the workforce in this discussion. So quite a bit of ground to cover. So Chris, let's dive straight into it. And I think a good place to start is to talk a bit about workplace transformation, particularly in the light of everything that's happened in the last few months, lockdown, COVID-19, work from home measures, etc. And I heard the other day that some corporates in South Africa are putting measures in place in the eventuality that a large portion of their people will be working from home until 2022. First of all, Dell is a technology company. I'm guessing you guys adapted to the lockdown fairly easily, and given how much you travel or used to travel, you have probably been quite happy to be grounded for a bit.
Yeah, well, so just on the travel question, yes, it's been fun. I think maybe we should ask my wife. One of my answers always used to be, people used to ask me, where I lived, and I said, well, if you ask my wife, she'll say on an airplane. So I'm one of those, permanent commuters. So it has been nice. It's been a real adjustment. So I think I'm ready to start again. Just hoping the airlines open up sooner.
You're missing the airport lounges and the business class seating.
Never business class. We keep our costs down.
Oh dear. But how has Dell managed through this period? Did the company take to it a bit like a duck to water, being a technology firm?
I'm proud to say we did, but it's not because we saw it coming. It's because as a company, all the way back in 2009, we launched our Connected Workspace initiative, mm-hmm. which was, it was a recognition that work is not a location. It's basically, you need to make sure that you are productive wherever you are, that you can respond to your colleagues, your customers, and whatever requirements there are in terms of your work, wherever you're located. And so the good news is that we've had this, decade of preparation for working remotely. When the lockdowns hit in the number of the geographies that we were working in, it was a matter of days we were able to relocate with very little disruption in terms of the service that we're able to offer our customers.
So you mentioned that you were a serial commuter, if I can call you that, before the lockdowns arrived. And it always amazes me, and I mentioned it to Doug as well in our podcast last week, it always amazes me how much time tech companies, multinational tech companies, spend traveling between countries for meetings. Is that different after this? Once this pandemic is over, do you expect you'll be back on the airplane as often as you have been in the past, or do you think there's been a fundamental shift in the way people think about business travel, meetings, etc.?
Wow, I think maybe it depends on timeframes that you look at, right? So I'd say if you break it out into maybe 3 to 5 year timeframes, I would say that maybe in 10 years' time we'll look back and say, okay, we're back where we were. I think that with any trend, you talk about it. I like to use the metaphor of a pendulum swinging, and it swings to one extreme and then kind of centers back in the middle. I don't think it's ever going to be the way it was. I lived in the States around 9/11, and the interesting thing there was how massively it transitioned from a time. You used to be able to walk onto an airplane and swap a boarding pass between all the different airlines within seconds, depending on where you were traveling. And I'm not sure if you've traveled in the States in the last decade or so, but you need 2 or 3 hours to get through the security these days. And so I think that hasn't, it's relaxed a little, but it's still there. And I think that we can expect the same kind of thing around this pandemic. People are going to be more cautious. I think there's going to be a lot more consideration regarding travel. But it doesn't take away from the fact that you do need to have some kind of a personal interaction with people. And I think, just basic things like what we're doing now, where you switch on video and you add to the experience around voice, makes a difference in terms of the way that we're interacting with people.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of companies are looking at virtual reality, augmented reality. There's a lot of investment going in those areas. We're talking to each other today on a video conferencing platform, but it's entirely feasible that in 10 years from now, we could appear to be in the same room together through some sort of augmented reality projection. We wouldn't necessarily be looking at each other through our computer screens, but it would look to me as if you, Chris, are sitting here in my office with me. When that happens, when we get to that level of technological advancement, which I imagine will happen in the next decade or so, does that change the game? Or do you think human beings will always need to press the flesh, as it were, to meet in person?
Wow. So as a personal opinion, I don't think, and it's about generations as well, I think, Duncan. So
Yeah.
if you look at it, I think that our, the digital generation, screen ages, whatever term they might give to them. And I think we've got to be very careful about categorizing different generations. But people who have grown up as digital natives are possibly a lot more comfortable with that than my generation. I hate to acknowledge that I'm not part of that generation, but I think that, we go back to one of your previous questions where you were talking to me about the way that we work. I joked about when we introduced this connected workplace in 2009, and we've been talking about the different personas and the way that people work, as I said, for quite a long time. But when I started out as a manager, if I couldn't see you, then I would assume you weren't working. Mm-hmm. It's just the way that we approach things now. In this day and age, you can't see anyone, right? Or we can see each other potentially by video, but we've got to get around the fact that it's around the way people work and the way we interact with them, and making sure that we make the requirements very clear in terms of what we expect people to do.
Yeah.
And I think this is the interesting part that I like around technology, is enabling them with the different tools that are available to do those tasks that we require of them.
Let's talk about generational differences. We know that the workplace was changing anyway before the pandemic hit, with millennials and Gen Zers starting to come into the workforce. And those generations have very different demands and expectations. How do you see the world of work changing, and what do you think these new generations of workers coming into the workforce now will require that's different from perhaps the demands that you and I made?
In a very basic answer to that would be that currently, from what I'm seeing in terms of the recruitment space of the newer generations, is a lot of employees place a high value on the devices and the tools that you give them to enable them to work, a lot higher than potentially previous generations. Right. I use an interesting example because we worked with a company called the Institute for the Future, who did a study over 40 plus countries around, what are important things when you recruit an employee. And interestingly, within Dell, what we had done is we decided we were going to, at the same time in the South African office, we decided we're going to create a pause area, put a barista and a coffee machine and a pool table, and make it like a nice, comfortable, interactive space. And then I started reading the results of the study, and what came back was that employees would value technology, or the tools to technological tools to make their job easier above those kind of things, that making pause areas more comfortable and things like that. So if you could give them a faster device, that's something that would make it easier for them to get their job done and deliver a better solution or product for their customers or team, they would appreciate that more than an interactive space that they could use during a break session. So with that, we obviously changed the way that we're dealing with technology inside Dell, which has been a really interesting change. So a few years back, I would say that we used to replace our employees' devices every 3 to 5 years, probably every 3 years, 2 to 3 years. Okay. We introduced a policy now where every year we give our employees a new device and the latest Dell device. And what it's done for morale and motivation, it's amazing, because really? I run the client solutions division, which is, all these endpoint devices. So, when I walk into the office, and there are a lot of these employees that you walk past on a daily basis, and when they get their new device, they're just so excited. They light up, and now they're obviously work in the technology industry, so they're really attuned to, you know, new
Sure.
tech and things like that. But they really, really appreciate it. And I've seen what it's done for morale and motivation. So you know, in firsthand, I've actually seen what you can do, rather than, you know, if you look at some of the organizations, particularly in the financial field, where the executives would get the latest device and every 2 years, and the executive device would be handed or cascaded down into the organization. So a new employee or an intern would walk in and get that, you know, I always joke about the keyboard that's full of breadcrumbs. That they would get that device. And there's a pushback against that at the moment. So it's like looking at them, just investing a little bit more in tech.
That's interesting, Chris, what you said about companies perhaps before this not trusting or not being able to see their workers and therefore not knowing whether those workers are being productive or not. A lot of companies have had a bit of a baptism by fire here and have had to experiment with this in a very real and tangible way. I've spoken to the CEOs of a few companies in South Africa who expressed their surprise that their employees' productivity has actually gone up through the lockdown. That employees are actually working longer hours, and that's not necessarily a good thing because they're no longer commuting. They are actually putting in more work and doing more productive work. Is that, do you think the corporate sector in South Africa generally has been surprised by this? Is it something that Dell is seeing as well, that productivity is actually rising through the pandemic?
I know that everyone's working longer hours. That I can absolutely assure you.
Yeah.
But it does depend on how you measure productivity, right? So yeah. What is it? What does the finished product look like? What is it that you're wanting employees to deliver? And I think if you're very much in terms of a database, or, you know, interacting with data and manipulating that and potentially presenting it in different formats, I can believe that people would be a lot more productive. With people, you know, in the graphics industry, you know, creatives and things like that, I can believe that they would be more productive in terms of what they push out.
Yeah.
But is that really all employees? You know, I think there are some things where more hours and more hours work don't necessarily mean a better product.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
Yeah. It also depends on industry, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, and I think when I look at it, you know, I mentioned this thing around creative. I think that, you know, a lot of the creative process comes from interacting and bouncing ideas off people. So it's around collaboration more than it is around, you know, you just sitting there with your single brain. I think, you know, two brains make a better decision than one. So if you start interacting with each other, and so coming back to your question, the initial reaction around, you know, how do we get this done? So we broke it down into 3 phases. The do it light, which was immediately get everyone productive. So provide them with a tool that will allow them to continue working and interacting with their colleagues and customers. And then I think we're moving into that phase now, you know, after the 100 days of lockdown, where it's do it right. Now, how do I start moving this tech, this new world, this new paradigm that we're working in? How do I start making sure that we use technology to create an environment as to what we had before, but potentially improve it? And a lot of that is around these collaboration applications. A lot of that is around these, you know, video conferencing being the simplest one. Yeah. You spoke about, you know, bringing in virtual reality and those kind of things. So those are definitely coming about. And then it's, you know, it's interacting with a screen, because it's a 2-dimensional, you know, screen that you're interacting with now. So how do you make life a little bit easier and, you know, continue to generate good output from your employees and keep them motivated? So that would be the next phase. I think that the do it right phase. And then lastly, we move into the innovation phase. So where you could actually end up with, as you were saying, more productive, but maybe a better product. Because I don't think if you're measuring productivity in hours, then you've missed the boat. You know, I don't think that is a good way to measure productivity. I think it's like, what are you generating in terms of, you know, output, customer value, you know, into the market. And I think that that's going to be a very exciting phase. And I think that'll come into things that we just spoke about, virtual reality, maybe some machine learning, AI, those kind of things.
I imagine a lot of companies sort of greeted this lockdown with quite a bit of shock. It probably was a bit of a shock to their systems. What sort of conversations are you having with your clients? And what are some of the challenges they've been facing through this lockdown period? And how do they see their remote work situations evolving over the coming period? And are they talking now about preparing for the next time this happens?
I haven't heard anyone preparing for the next time this happens. It's more about, I used the example where I was chatting to our team internally, trying to explain to them, that they need to empathize with what our customers are going through, because, we're going through the same thing. But in 6 months ago, in an organization that we would consider a customer, they probably had 5,000 employees in a very limited geographic space, a building or two, and rolling out new technology, supporting that technology was not too much of a stretch. I mean, it obviously requires constant intervention and things like that, but because it's one very limited geographic space, it's an easy thing to do. And now what you've got is this complete fragmentation. So those 5,000 employees are in 5,000 different locations. And the challenges that come with that are, there are many of them. But I like to break them down into, probably 4 broad categories. The first one is just deploying the technology. So previously, with deploying the technology, you would go down to the IT department, you'd pick up whatever new device it was, and they'd help you transfer your data across, or whatever it was, and then you'd start working, logging in, those kind of things. Now, you've got all those things. Can you come into the office? Have you got the necessary approvals and things like that? Have you made sure that you've filled in your questionnaire? And so our customers are saying, is it not a lot easier for us to actually just deliver the device to the person's home? Mm-hmm. And so we're starting to look at a whole lot of technologies that we've had available but really haven't been taken advantage of. And that's in what we term this our deploy space. But it's making sure that when the employee gets their new device, that it is it's ready to run. So they log on, all their applications there, their data potentially is there because they've used some kind of cloud storage, and they're up and running. And doing that for a 1,000, 10,000 employee organization is quite a challenge. So the deploy thing is something that they're looking at. The other thing that we're looking at is the security, because previously, if you were in an organization and you had applications or data that was quite sensitive, then you would say, well, I'm only going to allow employees, once they're in our WAN, to log in and access those applications. So there was security around that. Now, you don't have that option anymore. Mm-hmm. So you've got to make sure that you're securing the connection, and you've got to make sure that you're securing the data. And then you also got to make sure that now the attack vectors, I love that word, but there are a plethora of them now. There's just like they've multiplied logarithmically in terms of where you can now attack data. Prior to this pandemic, there were statistics that came out from some large organizations saying that 93% of data breaches or basically cyber attacks were happening at the endpoint. So that was, it's like a very large proportion. I believe that that's going to increase. And how do you protect all those spread out endpoints? So the security thing is kind of important, making sure now you've got a lot more sensitive data spread out across a lot more devices. Then it's around managing the devices. So in the new world that we're working in, we've got a whole lot of Windows 10 is actually quite an interesting challenge that we have alone, because it's never before has there been an operating system that is updated by Microsoft without intervention of the IT department. So every 6 months there's a new update coming out, and that creates some challenges because not all devices are made in exactly the same way. So the operating system may conflict with drivers, may conflict with, and we've seen quite a lot of those issues. So if you're not updating your BIOS and your firmware and your drivers on a regular basis, you could potentially have some challenges around the management of the devices and then accessing them. So tools around that, and we've got some really nice solutions around the management side of the business. And then the last thing is the support. And I spoke about when you were in a building, you'd be able to walk down the stairs and go to wherever it was, but go to your support department, or your IT department, and ask them to support your device. Now, support, it's a lot of that obligation for support is actually falling onto the end user. And so although people use these devices every day, supporting them is not it's definitely not a forte or something that they're specialized in. So we've got a number of tools, self-help tools, self-diagnostic tools that run in the background and help the users, diagnose what the issues are before they call support. And even very excitingly, we've moved to a stage now where we actually proactively diagnose. So if we start seeing a number of bad sectors being written to a hard drive, we actually automatically can log a call and replace that hard drive for the user before it actually fails.
Now, just before we started chatting today, Chris, the news broke that for the first time in almost 4 months, Eskom is going to start load shedding again. In fact, I think it's been running for about 25 minutes at the current time of this recording. And I imagine this is going to add a huge headache if this continues to IT departments that are trying to manage remote workforces.
Absolutely. So you have your device and you have your connectivity. So you're able to connect. But if all of a sudden your modem goes down or your router goes down, then you can't connect. And so you've got to consider those things in terms of in terms of load shedding. And the interesting thing around mobility and the what I mentioned earlier, the do it light versus do it right. A lot of organizations move to a notebook, and a number of reasons is because they could deploy a notebook to a user, they could go and work remotely, and they expected this only maybe to last a few weeks, and then they'd be back in the office, but the notebook could still be used. Yeah. And what we've been speaking to quite a few of our customers about is the option of using a desktop. It gives you the same kind of connectivity, but when you talk about load shedding and a desktop, then you are going to need some kind of a UPS or a generator, a backup generator to help you working. I think it's going to be some challenges during this winter season, especially regarding connectivity. I think you're going to get your probably 8 to 10 hours of battery life out of your notebook, but
if you remember to charge it.
If you remember to charge it, yeah. Which allows me to give you a quick punt here around our express charge from Dell, so you can get yourself to 80% of your power of your battery within an hour of charging.
Well played, Chris. Well played. So yeah, big challenges ahead, and I suppose companies are going to have to decide whether it makes economic sense for them to invest in some sort of battery backup, at least to keep people's employees' modems and routers running through load shedding during lockdown.
Absolutely. I mean, the other thing that you can have built-in modems on the device itself, so you actually just put a SIM card in, and we've got. Actually, South Africa's got a very high attach rate of those LTEs. So there you have got that. You no longer got that issue because most of the cell phone towers remain up whilst there is load shedding.
Yeah, no, good point there. So, as a matter of interest, what has the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic been on the tech industry here in South Africa, and specifically Dell? Have you weathered the storm quite well, given there's probably been growing demand from companies for laptops, etc., for employees to be able to work from home?
Yep. So I'm incredibly proud of our supply chain team. Yep. I think that that was pretty much the root of Dell's success came from its supply chain. It's always been a great strength, and during this pandemic, they were able to rise to the occasion. I don't know, Dell's annual results came out a few weeks ago around Q1, and we showed significant growth in the industry, and that's thanks to our supply chain. So they responded very well and continue to respond well. I think it's a key differentiator. So being able to get hold of technology and deploy it to our customers has been a reasonably easy thing. I think communicating with our customers continues to be a challenge because there's that interaction that we're talking about, which is remote. Mm-hmm. But we're able to respond to most of their challenges, and I think that our support has also been significant because we provide a kind of an out of the box on-site support, so that can be extended to whatever workplace employees are at. Interestingly, it's a negotiation between ourselves and our customers as to what type of a risk profile they'd like to accept, because our engineers obviously are going on site. So it's, there's that discussion that we're constantly engaging with them.
Chris, before we conclude today, I want to change tack quite radically and talk about electronic waste. And I know Dell is, this is a big focus for Dell. In fact, I believe Michael Dell has said that the company's vision is of recycling 1-to-1 by 2030, which is just 10 years away. First of all, how much of a problem is electronic waste?
Oh, it's significant. I mean, tons and tons. If you think about all of just the way that you make devices, you use a whole lot of volatile compounds to coat them and, paint them, then recycling them. If you think about, we just look at, I don't know who in South Africa wouldn't replace their cell phone every 2 years, but just think about that. So then you've got batteries and motherboards and things like that. And it's the same kind of thing that happens with a notebook and a desktop.
Yeah.
So it is a significant problem. And then there's the packaging. The packaging itself is also a challenge. So you've got all this waste that as you're moving products around, how do you actually dispose of those packages?
There was a good article, I think it may have been in Wired magazine a couple of years ago, saying how poor countries in West Africa, I think Nigeria specifically, have become dumping grounds for the West's e-waste, and the volume of it was quite staggering. And they had I think it was Wired magazine, had a big photo feature of all these discarded computers lying in landfills across Nigeria. But Chris, take us through what Dell Technologies is doing about e-waste. What is the company's strategy there?
I mentioned earlier we were talking about our supply chain. And interestingly, so it's like we are trying to build a fully recyclable device. That is our goal. And you're right, so that one of our moonshot goals we've got 4 of them, but one of the big ones is around making sure that we have a 1-to-1. So every device that we put into the market, we will recycle, 100% recycle the device. And it started probably about 8 years ago, where we really seriously started looking at our packaging. How can we reduce the size of our packaging? Because that alone reduces your carbon footprint. We're moving a lot of devices around the planet. And then in our packaging itself, how do we make that recyclable? As you observed earlier, that I'm from Cape Town, and I'm in Cape Town at the moment. So one of my great pet projects is the ocean plastics recycling, where our XPS devices have 100% packaging made out of recycled ocean plastics, making sure that we use cardboard and things like that. And I thought the quote once that I heard from Michael Dell is, I never want to walk past a landfill and see my name on a device in a landfill. And I think that it's very personal to him, so it becomes personal to us, because that really hit home. It's like, how do we make sure that doesn't happen? So there is that. And then there's also recycling the components in the devices themselves. And we've got a really nice program where we're recycling the gold, and we're making jewelry out of it for our customers. Interestingly, I got a stat the other day, you're talking about that Wired magazine statistic, but that there is more gold per ton in motherboards than there is in gold ore. So if you take a ton of motherboards, you'll find a higher proportion of gold in it than you will in a ton of gold ore.
That's amazing.
So there's a lot of recycling that we could do there as well. It's obviously a lot more difficult to get it out of the motherboards. Interestingly, you would think, but wait a second, a few kilometers underground, but it actually is more difficult to get it out. And so it's something that we continue working with. But the interesting thing is you have to work with your supply chain, because it's going to the people that supplied you packaging and saying to them, what are you doing to innovate? It's going to the people that supply you components and saying, what are you doing to innovate? And we've got close to eliminating the volatile compounds in the paint coatings that we're using on our devices now. We recycle a lot of the casings that we use, have got carbon fiber extracts from them. So we pioneered a strategy around taking aerospace carbon fiber and combining it with some plastic polymers and creating not only a stronger and a more heat-resistant cover, but making sure that we were recycling waste as well from the aerospace industry.
Good news indeed. Chris Buchanan is a Client Solutions Director at Dell Technologies South Africa. Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you, Duncan. Appreciate the time.